I'm super excited that we have someone who is new to the conference and hopefully will become a new conference regular, and that would be Dr. Julian Wamble of George Washington University, who you might know him from TikTok, but he's also known in his university for teaching a Harry Potter and Politics of Social Identity class. So let's please welcome Dr. Julian Wamble to the stage.
Wamble doesn't matter. It's all good. Yeah. Hello? Your wand is still here. You need that. You've got to have it. Okay. And I think... Okay. No. This is all I need right here. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Again, I'm Julian Wamble, and I'm so happy to be here. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to get started. So today I'm going to talk to us about Hermione Granger and the relativity of privilege. So I teach a class at George Washington on the politics of social identity. And what we kind of do is we look at the Harry Potter series through 7 themes, and one of those themes is privilege. And so what I'm giving you is much more than my students really ever get. Normally they just get rants and raves from me, not slides at all. So they'll be very jealous. But what I want to talk about today is this idea of privilege, which is really part of our zeitgeist. We hear a lot of conversations surrounding the idea of privilege: white privilege, male privilege, cis, het, white, rich privilege. Like we get it. It's everywhere. And there is a bit of an understanding that we might have that's implicit to this idea that like either you have it or you don't. And if you've got it, then there's a moral attachment to the idea of what it means to be privileged. And so when people hear like, oh, your privilege is showing, we all run in the other direction. People get offended. I've seen it all on the internet. I get it a lot on the internet myself when I make these kinds of comments. And so what I want us to think about today is the notion of relativity. Because of this kind of either you've got it or you don't, I think that sometimes we miss the mark in our own understandings of what it means to be privileged. And so when I talk about privilege, what I mean, and this is a definition that is used, sorry, also I'm a mover, so that's why I took it off the stand. When I talk about privilege, I'm using a definition that is used by a number of scholars across many different disciplines. And so to be privileged is to have a special advantage. The notion of privilege itself is something that is granted and not earned. It's an entitlement that people have. It tends to be exercised for the benefit of oneself or the group. Now, this is not always the case. This is not absolute in itself. And it also tends to operate outside the awareness of the beneficiary. So generally speaking, privileged people don't recognize that they are operating from a privileged space, hence the your privilege is showing remark, right? And so this is the definition that we'll be working with. So why Hermione? Number one, because I'm a harbinger of chaos, and Hermione has a sense of untouchability within the fandom, right? I posted a video critiquing the character once, and someone wrote in the comments, I support Hermione's rights and her wrongs. There is a sense amongst individuals in the fandom that like Hermione is untouchable. And like Voldemort in Goblet of Fire, I just want to run up to her forward and go, touch, right? Like that is what I want to do. And so part of my motivation for using her is because I think that she serves as a really great example, number one, because of the untouchability, number two, because of the position that we tend to see her within the wizarding hierarchy. We tend to understand her as an individual who operates from a space that is inherently not privileged. And so I want to think about these notions of hierarchies using a quote from Kingsley Shacklebolt from the Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. So this is a moment where they're listening to the radio on the Horcrux hunt. And Kingsley says, I'd say that it's, and so Kingsley is asked by Lee Jordan, what do you say to people who might say that I don't want to protect non-magical people? And Kingsley says, I'd say that it's one short step from wizards first to purebloods first, and then to Death Eaters. And in this quote, I argue that there are a way for us to think about the different social hierarchies that dominate within the magical world. The first is this notion of wizards first. So within that, we're thinking about what I would call kind of a paradigm of magical versus non-magical. So now, generally speaking, when we think about the magical world, we spend a lot of time in it, and we don't actively really engage with the non-magical world unless we're at the Dursleys as readers, right? So, but what we see in that dynamic is that, like, the Dursleys' house is destroyed more times than we can even count. When we think about the interactions that they have with the magical world, there's a clear hierarchy at work here, right? Where magical people, I mean, if we think about the moment where Arthur Weasley comes to collect Harry, they literally blow up the fireplace because they didn't think it was going to be there. And then they, torment Dudley with the tung toffee. And then Mr. Weasley is so confused as to why it is that they just didn't let him fix it. But their relationship with magic is one where they are, one, not being able to consent to the amount of magic that they have and that they have to endure. And secondly, they don't have any power to fight back, right? So this is a hierarchy at work here where we're seeing magical people being able to assert themselves against non-magical people. Just returning back to the quote to kind of keep us on task. And so then we have the wizards first, and then it's purebloods first. Now, this is a hierarchy that we are used to because we spend so much time in the world, right? So we have purebloods, we have half-bloods, we have Muggle-borns, and we have squibs, right? So this is a space where we spend the vast majority of our time as we read these books. And so it's in this particular hierarchy that we focus most of our attentions, right? And when we think about Hermione, right, we recognize that she is on the bottom of this particular hierarchy. She's not a squib, so she's above squibs, but in the realm of magic, people with the ability to actually do magic, she is at the bottom. Now, Kingsley's quote leaves out one more hierarchy, and I think it speaks to the idea of privilege, and that hierarchy still focuses on wizards first, but it's the relationship that wizards have with magical creatures. So in this particular moment, when Kingsley is inviting magical people to say, hey, remember that we're all human. That's literally what he says. He says, we're all human. As if we don't meet on the Horcrux hunt Griphook and Gornock, who are with Ted Tonks and Dean Thomas. And so it is clear to us, right, that wizards and magically able people are not the only ones who are being affected by what is happening. And yet there's an invitation to only focus on those individuals. And maybe it was an oversight on the part of Kingsley, but that in and of itself speaks to the privilege, right? And so this hierarchy is one that is important for us to consider. So again, I just want to remind us of what our definition is of privilege that we're thinking about. And this is important because I want us to, as we begin to move into a space of thinking about what this means for Hermione, I want us to just kind of have this in mind. I also want to kind of point to what I think is the kind of biggest totem of privilege, if you will, and that is wands. So we take for granted wands. When we enter into the magical world as readers, what we see is Harry just goes and buys one. But what we forget, wands are expensive. They are not cheap. And if any of you have gone to the wizarding world of anything, you know that. But in the magical world, they are also expensive. We know this because Ron has a secondhand wand. Neville does as well. And it isn't until Ron's wand, one, breaks, and two, they win the kind of contest that they are able to buy one. So there is an inherent, even within the wizarding world, there's an inherent privilege to not only having a wand, but having one that has chosen you. So this is important because I think it also creates its own sense of a hierarchy, and we recognize the importance of wands also because when we think about those individuals and creatures who want access to them but also are denied that access. And so when we think about the statue of magical brethren, so this is kind of a description, what we see here is an explicit invocation of the idea of wands in this hierarchy that is set up, right? So we have the wizard using his wand and pointing out. We have the centaur, the goblin, and the house elf beneath this looking up adoringly. And what we know, right, is that goblins speak explicitly about the desire of wanting wands, and we know that the law forbids them from having it. We know that this is also true for house elves, right? Because when Winky is caught with Harry's wand, Barty Crouch Sr. is like, that's literally against the rules. And so that even though these creatures have the ability to do magic, they are without the actual kind of status symbol that comes along with being able to wield a wand. So this also helps us understand and kind of contextualize the notion of privilege within the context of the magical world if we simply think of nothing else other than the possession of a wand. So now, the question that we are going to get to is Hermione privileged? Now, there are a lot of reasons why I would say no, of course not, right? And one of the chief reasons of that would be, again, because of this particular hierarchy. So yes, she is at the bottom of this particular hierarchy of magically abled individuals. She is a Muggle-born, and we know that she experiences any number of epithets. We know that at the end of as the series is ending, they are literally rounding up Muggle-borns. We know that they are taking their wands away, right, which re-emphasizes the notion of what it means to have a wand and have access to magic. Now, what's interesting about this particular thing, and this is a bit of a caveat, but just go with me for a second. I've got more time. I'm talking faster than I thought I would. Is that they are taking away wands, and one of the biggest kind of conceptions of magic within the magical world is that you need a wand to do it. But we know you don't. Right, like we know that younger kids don't have it. We know Harry didn't when he was, disappearing, regrowing his hair and doing shrinking sweaters. And so that there is a conception that you need a wand to be able to perform magic when actually you don't. And we know, like in the post-canonical lore, that there are other cultures wherein they don't use wands at all to do magic, right? So we know that in the kind of African continent, broadly construed, we know that they are not using wands. And so that wands, again, serve as more than just a conduit for one's power, but rather a symbol of one's belonging in a space. So the fact that Hermione has a wand, in and of itself, privileges her. I also want to point out within this particular hierarchy that there are often times where we see this hierarchy being made akin to race in our own kind of understanding of it. I think that there are aspects of this that are true, but also, like, I'm black. You see that. I know I shocked you all. You just were like, wait, what? But you cannot see one's blood status. You don't know whether or not Hermione is a pureblood. We can guess, right? Her last name gives it away. There are other social things we might be able to tap into, but we don't know. If she didn't tell anyone, they wouldn't know. We know that Dumbledore's mom tried to pass as not Muggle-born. We know that in these spaces and places that while, yes, like there are aspects of this, again, that speak to our own understanding of race, magic as a construct is not something that one can just say, oh, I saw you and I know what you are. And we also know that this idea isn't in and of itself socially constructed because Voldemort. Harry literally tells Bellatrix, like, hey, your guy is a half-blood, and she's like, you're dumb, shut up. And completely ignores the idea of it, because this idea is not necessarily meaningful insofar that when it is, and when it's not, it's not. Which again re-emphasizes the idea of what it means to be a privileged individual in this space. So maybe here we see this, and since we spend so much time in these books, in this particular hierarchical space, our understanding of Hermione is she's Muggle-born. Rita Skeeter writes an article about her in Witch Weekly, and everything is about her Muggle-born identity. That's the only thing that we see. And so we as readers are digesting the idea of her as a Muggle-born and allowing that to be the only thing that tends to be true for her. But if we think about this hierarchy, she has a wand, and she has power over non-magical people. And we see her use that when she modifies her parents' memories. Now, I am not making some sort of moral statement about whether or not she should and shouldn't have done that. That's a different conversation for a different day. But the reality is that she could, and she did. And again, whether or not she did it for whatever reason is inconsequential to the fact that she had the ability to do it. She did it without the consent of her parents, as far as we know. And they could not fight back. They couldn't say no. And even if they did say no, she still did it. So there is an access to power that they do not have. And it's important for us to realize, like, again, perhaps in one hierarchy, she may be deficient in privilege. But in another one, in this one, she's got it, hand over fist. And what we also see is that she is socialized by Hogwarts, and we as readers are socialized by Hogwarts to understand that what she does in this hierarchy is fine. The modification of memories is something that we see done over and over and over and over again in these books with impunity. Like, they just do not care. And there's a presumption that it does not do anything. It's meaningless. But then we see Bertha Jorkins. Then we see what happens to Mr. Roberts at the Quidditch World Cup. All of these examples of these kinds of things going awry very quickly and very easily. And so the idea then that in this particular context, magical people have a power and a privilege over those who are not magically abled. And again, we see this a ton of times with the Dursleys, but what we tend to overlook because of the way that we as readers are conditioned by these books is to recognize these things as potentially being problematic and also an indicator of one's privilege. And then when we think about this hierarchy, now, we know that Hermione is a champion of house elves, and we know that she spends a considerable amount of time, exercising the privileges that she has to try and get other magically abled people on her side. But then at a certain point, she abandons that particular endeavor when she realizes it's not quite working out. And then she just takes to knitting sweaters and hiding them, and knitting hats and hiding them in the Gryffindor Tower. And I think that the thing about this, and it's something that I bring to bear often when I discuss this with my students, is again, house elves are not in the position to be able to say, no. They do. They simply reject the idea, but they don't have, they do have the power. They just don't recognize it as being used against unless necessary. But Hermione is actively using her ability as a magically abled person to assert her will over this population of people. And what else is interesting about this is that part of that mentality is the presumed inferiority of house elves, when in reality, house elves can do a ton of things that magical people cannot. The fact that Dobby is bouncing in and out of Hogwarts left and right in Chamber of Secrets, when we are constantly reminded by Hermione that that's not allowed, that you can't do that. We were talking last night about Creature in the cave, and how Voldemort in no way presumed that he would be able to leave. And so that there are all these instances where we are seeing this power, but part of Hermione's privileged understanding is that, no, she literally says they are brainwashed and don't know any better. And so that the privileged position that she is in is one that comes from her understanding, even if somewhat slightly modified, of her positionality within this space. And so she recognizes her privilege in this particular domain when it comes to creatures that she may see as inferior. But when it comes to goblins, she's like, they don't need our help. She kind of uses a number of instances wherein she kind of has some very not so great belief structures about centaurs. And she says, like at one point when talking about Ferenzi, I'm not a fan of horses. And so there are any number of moments where we see her kind of coming at this from a very privileged position. And that is not negated by her being Muggle-born. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to certain contexts and certain hierarchies, Hermione Granger has a ton of privilege. And not only does she have it, she doesn't necessarily recognize it as being what it is. And I think what I enjoy about using Hermione in this way is because, like, when we look at Ron, we're like, of course you're privileged, you're pureblood. When we look at Harry, we're like, of course you're privileged, you're Harry. Like, you got that scar, that's doing a lot of work for you. When we look at Hermione, we say, no, she's our queen, slay. And we don't ask too many questions, and part of that is because of the marginalization that we recognize as being true, the victimization that we watch her experience at the hands of Bellatrix Lestrange, Draco Malfoy, any of these other pureblood supremacists. We recognize that, like, yes, she is marginalized, but that marginalization does not negate the privileges that she has in other contexts, wherein she is actively operating from a perspective and from a place of being someone with immense power. And so when we think about the idea of what it means to be privileged, there are contexts where marginalized people are still privileged. I tell my students all the time, like, I am a black man. I know, again, I'm so sorry to surprise you, but I'm still a man. I don't worry about walking home at night for danger of my bodily safety. I very rarely think about what it means if I have a drink and turn around really quickly and what that means for me. I have the privilege of being a man. My blackness does not negate that idea. It may work in tandem in certain contexts, but in other contexts, I'm just a man. And in that way, in certain contexts, Hermione is a Muggle-born. And we see at the end of the series, as we are kind of recognizing the kind of structural oppression of Muggle-born people, that yes, in that context, she is marginalized. But there are many other spaces and places wherein she operates with a level of privilege that is bestowed upon her because she has a wand, because she's Harry Potter's best friend, and because she's exceptional in terms of her intellect. And the latter point is really important because it's one wherein she knows. I think in the first book, she realizes it when they are deciding to go down into the labyrinth is what we'll call it. We can't call it the chamber because that's not yet. But she says, no one's kicking me out. I got 112 on that exam. She knows in that way that she is able to bypass certain things because of how smart she is. And so I think she invites us to really think about the nuances of concepts like privilege because she operates with it in certain cases. And I think that she really does allow us to think about shunting the notion of the kind of absolutism that we tend to approach the notion of privilege with because of the different ways that we have to kind of think about how various hierarchical contexts dictate when privilege is pertinent and when it isn't. And with that, I thank you.